Good morning, folks. The spin has already begun in what is a highly unusual situation occurring on Reconciliation Day, Dag, the 16th of December, 2025. South African immigration officials raided a U.S. diplomatic activity in Johannesburg. And the spin has already started. Peter du Toit just published a story on News 24 within the last 20 minutes saying that South African authorities issued deportation order for illegal Kenyan volunteers at U.S. Refugee Center. Well, it is a U.S. refugee center, so shame on you, Peter du Toit, for your inability to actually quote things correctly. If you want to use the term volunteers because it's in dispute, that's a fair point. He said South African authorities, including the police and Department of Home Affairs, served 7 Kenyan nationals doing illegal paid work in Johannesburg with deportation orders on Wednesday. The Kenyans were working for an intermediary organization processing so-called Afrikaner refugees and were in the country on a 90-day tourist visa when they were apprehended by authorities. A couple of things about this. First off, here's the situation. Now, when the South African government famously went to great lengths to say arrogantly they were not going to issue work permits to Kenyans working for Refugee Services, RSC, a subsidiary of Church World Services, RSC. When they said they weren't going to issue those visas back in August, if I remember correctly, I later heard many anecdotal stories that Kenyans were in fact in South Africa doing things, screening people. And I said, that seems odd because they don't have work permits. And at the time, you can go back and check the content if you want to scourge through all my content and troll through it. I said repeatedly that if they're there, the only way they could be there is if they're volunteering their time. But I'm not sure how they do that because they're going to have to pay for accommodation. They're going to have to live somewhere. So I'm not sure how they do it. So I don't know if there's any legs to this story, but the bottom line is I said in the past that they don't have work visas to work there. So I'm not sure if the Kenyans are there. That's why I didn't run with this story earlier, but I was informed by someone earlier today, a witness who was at the site, a refugee aspirant, who said they saw a black person with an African accent that was and I'll leave it at that, okay? But they're saying 7 Kenyan nationals were illegally worked there. Now, Peter du Toit, once again, is a shameful individual. He says so-called Afrikaner refugees. Well, first off, they're no so-called. They are refugees under international definition for refugee. And in this case, what happened today makes it very clear that they're refugees because this was political oppression, political persecution. That's what happened today. Well, yesterday, the 16th of December. And they're not Afrikaners. This nonsense, this demonic obsession with lying about the program. I've just received an email from a colored family living in California who are not happy with their arrangements and are trying to sort something out, asking for my assistance to help get them a little bit of things sorted out. A colored family. I've spoken to Indian family in Virginia in the past and other coloreds. It's just utter nonsense. They're not Afrikaner refugees, and putting quotes around them doesn't change the story. All right? So that issue. Their initial visa applications to do volunteer work in South Africa were denied by the Department of Home Affairs, which was later informed that the group was indeed engaged and paid for work. So that's a little confusing. So you deny their visa applications for volunteer work, then how did they get a visa to come to the country? I think he misunderstood. I think Home Affairs informed him properly. Their initial visa for working in South Africa was denied, and they were granted tourist visas. So I'm not really sure where he's going with that. Now, he says, according to News 24's information, American officials were kept informed of the unfolding standard immigration operation by police and Home Affairs. Okay, first off, if police were present, no one present saw them in police uniforms, SAPS uniforms. They could have been undercover. There were people in civilian clothes that are reserving things, perhaps. And this is not an operation that's legally authorized unless the police are there. So I question the veracity of what the police were there. And I want a briefing from SAPS about this. That's the first thing. A standard immigration operation on a national holiday? Are you serious? Raiding a diplomatic activity? That's not standard. Not standard anything. That is beyond the pale unusual. And the Americans were kept informed of the unfolding immigration operation? Really? That's not what Washington says. That's not what Washington believes. And ask yourself this question. If the Americans were informed of what was going to happen there, why in the world would they have sent as many as 200 or more refugee applicants to that center? Why would they have people who were flying out that night be there? Why would they do that? They wouldn't do that. They're not stupid. They wouldn't put those people at risk. They wouldn't expose their identities. They wouldn't put them in a bind with police showing up there. That just doesn't make any sense. And if the Americans were aware of this operation, do you think it's not unreasonable to expect that they would have put the Kenyans on a plane and flown them out before they were kicked out of the country? So that's bullshit. That's total bullshit. There's no way the American officials kept informed. Now, maybe what he's trying to say claim is that once they arrived at the scene for the standard operation, then they informed the Americans present. But that's also not true. I have multiple eyewitness statements that claim that the Americans grabbed their material, grabbed their laptops, grabbed their documents, and exited the building as they helped get refugees out of there. So if they were kept informed, which Americans were informed? This is balderdash. They say that the Kenyans' passports were checked and it was found that they did not have the correct entry visas. Well, yeah, if they're working, yeah, you're right. They're expected to return to Kenya voluntarily on Monday night. Okay, that's a week from now. So Monday night, that's plenty of time for them to leave. He says that no American official was arrested by South African authorities and there was no interference with the refugee program conducted by the U.S., a senior government official who has direct knowledge of events told News 24. Well, that senior government official is lying. Dozens of people saw otherwise. No interference with the refugee program. The fact that you raided a diplomatic activity and violated the Vienna Conventions is proof that you interfered with the program. And the deputy spokesperson for the State Department has said as much. Tommy Pickett said so when questioned by the traditional media today. The premises where the refugee processing and screening are conducted are also not diplomatic premises or locations. That's true, but it isn't germane. It's not germane. It is not germane. If the authorities in Uganda raid a U.S. refugee processing mission in Uganda for South Sudanese refugees, that is an international incident. An international incident. If South African officials do the same thing in South Africa, that's an international incident. This is a provocation. Peter du Toit's story has holes in it. Now, I'm not accusing Peter du Toit other than using quotes for refugees and falsely lying to the public about who the program is for. That I'll accuse him of because that's factual. But I'm not accusing him of the misstatements that the government's here. He's claiming he has sources that are saying these things. Again, let's run through it. Peter du Toit is saying 7 Kenyans who working illegally in South Africa. I believe that's plausible. I myself have pointed out that it doesn't make sense that they could only be there as volunteers. So, plausible. He said that the American officials were informed. That doesn't pass muster. If the American officials were informed, they never would have put the safety or the identity of the people who were showing up that day in jeopardy. They would have postponed it, or they would have gotten the Kenyans out of there. If the South African immigration officials and police, they claim police were there, but no one has evidence of seeing police, at least not in uniform. If they had told the American officials about it, then I'm certain the Americans would have either cooperated with them and this whole thing wouldn't have happened, or they would have gotten the Kenyans on a plane and flown them home. So I call bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. Let's see what the Trump administration has to say today, the 17th of December, and let's see what we hear from Durko and Home Affairs. But this is an unprecedented provocation. And it was done intentionally. What day? On a public holiday. Please, could somebody from Home Affairs identify all the raids that occurred on a public holiday of December 16th around the country? How many other places were raided for illegal aliens working illegally in South Africa on the 16th of December? Could somebody please identify that? Would one of the so-called journalists in South Africa or real journalists in South Africa please inquire at Home Affairs how many operations were conducted? There may have been some, but I'm curious because I strongly suspect there aren't many operations done on a public holiday by Border Management Authority. Certainly not in Joburg, and certainly not intruding on the activities of foreign diplomats. What say you, South Africa, Mzansi? Cheers.